So yeah, welcome again to this webinar. And as I was saying, we're both based at the Urban Big Data Center, and really we're coming from sociology, social science perspective on this topic of researching data uses, needs, and capabilities by local authorities. So based at the Urban Big Data Center, which combines social science with data science. But here today, we're really going to bring the social science perspective to this topic. So to get us started and warm up a little bit on this broad topic, I would like to do a little round of Mentimeter, which I'm sure you have engaged with before. And if not, I'm just going to guide you on how to do that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and share the other screen, if it's okay with you. So it's really a way of warming up and starting engaging with the topic. So hopefully you will please let me know using the chat or just even turn on your mic if you can't see my screen or can't hear me, or if there's any problem with the Menti. So you should just go on to www.menti.com and then you will be prompted to put a code which is appearing now on the screen, and you should see it. So it's 36868078. And the first question today is, what types of data do you think local government produce and use? And I know it's a very broad question, and it's just to get us started and warming up a bit around this topic. So I would let you get, yeah, exactly, perfect. And we'll see the answer popping in on the word cloud on the screen. And that should be an interesting exercise. So we quite a number of participants. I'm going to give it some time. Any more data? Yeah. Yeah, so we have a survey data that is coming out strongly, a wide range of other data that are all related to local government. So yeah, social demographics data such as age, gender, yeah, more quantitative data, but also qualitative data with interview data, spatial, so different type of data, spatial data as well. Concealed tax homelessness, yeah. Really interesting. Census data. Yeah, so using this. Yeah, so obviously continue to fill in if you haven't done so, but I think it really shows the wide range of data that local government use, and that, so for instance, census data, and that local government also produce, so data around housing occupancy, road network, yeah, transportation, concealed taxes, all of this. Fantastic. Yeah, so hopefully this gives you, like, it really warms up for this webinar and gives us already a good overview of the complexity of this topic. Okay, so now I'm going to move hopefully to the next question. Okay, and you should be prompted with a question now, which I will bring up onto the screen. Same code, and I'm, yeah. So what do you think are the challenges of doing research with local authorities? It's a very open question. So I'm curious to see what challenges you think are there when we start thinking about doing research and data with local authorities. Please let me know if it works with Mentimeter, but it should be okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's also started arriving. Yeah. So I can see now authenticity of data. So some data gaps, license data bias. Yeah, so some more like kind of the technical infrastructure of data, but also broader kind of governance issues emerging here, like politics, I guess, not matching boundaries. So that can be with data, but that can be also within local government, I guess. Timescales, yeah. Skills is also a very important one that is emerging here, yeah. Just leaving some more time for people to engage. Not open access is also an important challenge that you can encounter doing research with local authorities here. Anything else? Okay, we'll leave it for one more minute and then maybe moving on. Yeah. Lack of consistency, access to data, yeah. So I think it's obviously a similar topic at not open data, access, lack of data, yeah. Access, yeah, so I think we have here a good overview of some of the technical, like the technical infrastructure issues around the data itself, access, its quality, consistency, where it's located, its ownership, but also maybe broader issues and challenges around governance and timescale of local government, politics of local governments, the skills, data skills also that are available to local governments. So all of this, GDPR, so the legal framework as well. So really, this really captures well the variety of challenges, but also opportunities when you're doing research with local authorities to engage with these challenges and hopefully try to sort them or resolve them at least as much as possible. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing this and hopefully this giving us some food for thought, and I'm just going to share again the presentation. Okay, so the structure of the seminar, the training webinar today would be around 4 discussion points, and I think understanding of the landscape of local government and its different data uses. And I think that's really important to get started with doing research on data users, needs and capabilities with local authorities is really understanding the context in which those uses and needs are located. Then we're going to get into more details around how do we map the different data types that a local government uses and produces, and also the different areas of data engagement. And hopefully you will know more about that at the end of the webinar. Then we will look at designing a mixed methods approach to doing research on data users, needs and capabilities with local authorities, and combining qualitative research methods with quantitative research methods. And finally, we will look at collaboration and its essential role in the project we run, as I was mentioning earlier, with the Digital Office for Scottish Local Government on Scottish local authorities data engagement during COVID-19. So that's the project Simon and myself were running for the last year. So you can see at the bottom on the screen, there's a link to the full report if you're interested. And I will share the slides as well at the end anyway. So this is going to be the 4 discussion point of the webinar today. Please let me know if you have any question using either the chat function or raising your hand, and I will give you also some opportunity to engage during the webinar. So starting with understanding the landscape of local government and its data users, I think what's really important here to remember, and I'm sure you're aware of this, local government has a very complex organizational structure. And it also has a breadth of policy areas and deliver really a wide range of services. So here I've just put on the right a table that summarizes the main areas of responsibility of local authorities in Scotland, and that really gives you an understanding of the wide range of policy areas they are dealing with. So education, social care, environmental protection, roads and transport, economic development, housing and planning, waste management, and cultural and leisure services. So if you think in terms of data and the data they collect in each of these areas of responsibility, you can quickly see how various this is going to be. And this complex organizational structure of local government and the range of services they deliver is also topped by the fact that they engage, obviously, with, first of all, other public sector organizations like Police Scotland or NHS bodies and share data with them, but also other entities such as sector organizations and private companies. And all of this is kind of embedded within an ecosystem of organization at national and local levels. So for example, in terms of digital transformation and local government, the Improvement Service and the Digital Office for Scottish Local Government are really two key across local government organizations that are active in that field. So they're also supporting local government with data sharing. And I think when you're looking at doing research on this topic, it's very important to look at these organizations as well. So this is more an understanding of the landscape of local government when it comes to digital transformation, but also it's kind of important to look at the different types of data activities that local government are doing on a daily basis. And here it's quite helpful to look at the diagram that I've collected from Van Horen, Ubaldi, and Welby. I've provided the resources at the end, and again, I will share the slides with you. But here, so it's 4 kind of main activities. So first of all, collecting and generating data, then storing, securing, and processing this data. The third one is around sharing, curating, and publishing. And the last one is using and reusing data. So already you can see the variety of data activities that local government is involved with. And in terms of data users, local government use data for a wide range of reasons. So that could be operational monitoring, that could be making more strategical decisions and using performance and indicator using data. That can be monitoring the services uptake and trying to predict future trends and tailoring services. That could be designing policy or informing policy making. So really, again, I keep putting an emphasis on that, but it's a wide range of data activity, data applications, and different type of data that local government uses. So maybe it might be useful now just to stop for a minute and think, what do we mean by data? And here, helpfully, Robert Kitching has provided a definition, as you can see on the screen. So data is the raw material produced by abstracting the world into categories, measures, and other representational forms. And here you start thinking, this is going to be massive. It's a very wide encompassing definition. And these forms are constitute the building blocks from which information and knowledge are created. So you start thinking, we need some more categories or something more like a narrower definition of what we mean by data to really try to engage local government. And Kitching has provided several criteria that you can use to define data, and in particular big data. And I'm sure you know and you're aware of the first how big data is traditionally defined with the 3 V's. So volume, so it's very large quantities of data, velocity created in real time, and variety, so structured, semi-structured, unstructured data. And since this first definition came about in 2014, there's been like a number of other criteria added to it. So you have exhaustivity, relationality, resolution, scalability. So you can see that on the screen. And he tried in his work to really distinguish between big data and small data. So that will be one way of looking at what do we mean by data and trying to narrow it down. However, you have other way of looking at this, and that might be too technical for your participants. So another way that to look at trying to map data type and engage with the different types that local government uses, might be looking at the idea of the data spectrum, which was published by Open Data Institute, which is based here in the UK. And here you have three kind of criteria. You have, again, the size. So they categorize it between small, medium, and big data. So really it's a spectrum rather than clear-cut categories. You have the type. So on the top, you can see personal versus commercial versus government data. Government data sometimes is understood as more administrative data, but more recently, government is also starting collecting and generating more novel types of data, such as social media data, such as sensor data, for instance, using smart bins, or such as mobile phone data, using commercially owned data and getting that. So again, a spectrum. And often this data is personal, but also aggregated and anonymized. So again, like, it's really important to see it as a spectrum, as the diagram shows. And the last criteria is around accessibility. So here you have closed data, shared data, and open data. And again, a spectrum with different type of access to this data and examples. So other classification that you will find online, and there are plenty, can be public sector data versus private sector versus community data. So again, it's really seeing that there are many, many ways of looking at what different types of data and how you can categorize it and what might be the most helpful for your research questions, but also what type of categories are familiar and talk to your participants. Because if you choose, for instance, personal, commercial, and government data, and think that's helpful for me, if your participants don't really engage with this type of categories, that might be difficult for them to take part in the research. So it's really thinking both ways. So here I want to use a quick example, and maybe you can use the chat function, because we are 23 people here, so that might be difficult if I ask everybody to do that. But if we look at mobility, what types of data, keeping in mind all of these different categories, so what specific type of data do you think local government uses and generate to understand mobility? So if you could just try to make some guesses here in the chat. Traffic surveys, yeah. Yeah, vehicle counts, which interesting, vehicle counts can be both kind of novel data if they use sensors, but that could also be cordon, which they do several times a year. Yeah, use of service like Nextbike, definitely. Yeah, I think they would definitely love data on how do we commute to work. I think that's really something they would love to have more detailed data on. Census, household data on mobility, yeah. Ticket sales on public transport. Yeah. Surveys, yeah. Yeah, public transport. Yeah, so definitely all of this is absolutely what they use. So I've mapped roughly what Glasgow City Council use at the moment, and I'm sure it's not exhaustive, but yeah, so there are traffic sensors and bike counts as well that are installed by the council, and that they do collect that. There is also at the moment a project with actually UBDC, which they're looking at CCTV anonymized pedestrian counts, and they're developing this and will use that for understanding mobility. So that's more on the kind of real-time data. Then there's less real-time data, and I think you've mentioned that in the chat. So obviously surveys, census, statistics, the cordon, which has also like the the sensing and counting the number of cars or numbers of buses, but literally doing that manually. And then you have also private data or private phone data that can be real time or can be like more historic data. So you have obviously the data around the different type of public transport, so SPT, ScotRail, buses company. Nextbike, which was mentioned in the chat, there is also an IPA for that. Strava data, which was made available to all cities recently by the company, or even more broadly, Google mobility data, which obviously they won't have a lot of granularity in those data, but these are all potential types of data that are used by local government. Yeah, okay. So here, I'm just going to present the terminology that we used in our project and why we decided to go for that one. So the typology is around 5 different type of data, and we first decided to use public sector, private sector, third sector terminology, which is used by several scholars. And we decided actually to distinguish between internal and external public sector data. And that was really because we were interested in capturing data, local governments' data uses, but also how they interact with other organizations, and that included other public sector organizations. So the first public sector data is data collected either by local government or by Scottish, UK government and public bodies. And as I say, it's internal or external. Third sector data, we define that as data provided by charities, voluntary organizations, community groups, and social enterprises. Private sector data is data provided commercially by private companies and data brokers. And then we added onto this terminology novel data, which we define as new types of digital data collected by via also social media or application, or via connected infrastructure and sensors such as the Internet of Things. And we are aware that there is an overlap between private sector data and novel data, in particular within Smart City initiative that are taking place within local government. But really our research was interested in capturing where the local government was using these novel forms of data. So that's why we decided to add it onto the typology. Okay. Oof. Oh, sorry, just going too fast. So here really what I wanted to add and to really highlight is there is no one way of looking at data and creating one typology that works for every context. I think it's really trying to think about your research question and what you're interested in capturing and adjusting your typology to that. So really scoping the literature, eventually, if possible, engaging with the stakeholders and people, data practitioners and local government to really see if your terminology resonates with their experiences, and really trying to align your typology to your research objectives. And here I'm just going to ask if you have any question at this stage. So you can raise your hand or interact in the chat if you have any questions. Yeah, there's one question by Emily.
Hi, thanks. This has been really interesting so far. I don't know how much engagement you did with people working in local authorities about this typology and how much it was informed by their understandings of different data types and their uses.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good question. Thanks for asking. And you will see in the tips later, I'm going to touch on that. We created this typology by both scoping the literature, so using the different typology I presented and others. But also we went back to the Digital Office for Scottish Local Government, which is the organization that works with local government in Scotland and help them, support them in their digital transformation, and really ask them, does that resonate with you? Is it something that makes sense? Because we didn't want to come and kind of impose one terminology. When we use also the terminology in the research, and particularly in our survey, we also defined it clearly at the beginning, so to make sure that it was clear for participants. So that's how we dealt with this.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions? No, okay. So I will move on from here, but again, like, feel free to ask questions at any time. Okay, so the second area, when we started the project, we were looking at different data types and how local government use these different data types. And then we said, well, actually, there are more to it. And we started mapping to map the local government data engagement, the different areas in which it engage in relation to data. And here we had several iterations of this. And we had discussion with the digital office about this as well, is really trying to understand what are the different aspects of data engagement within local government. And here we were, okay, so there are different data types, obviously, but also they are engaging, local government is engaging within a broader data ecosystem. And I think I've mentioned that already. They're sharing data with public sector organizations, subsector, private corporation. They're collaborating together to generate insight and so on. So it was more than only the data types. So we started mapping this around 4 areas. So the first one was around the different sources of data for local government that are external to local government. Then the different type of data capabilities that they use and need and maybe lack in some aspect to engage with data. Then the data sharing that they do with external organization. And then if possible at all, if we were interested in capturing the collaboration that were taking place. And I'm just going to go into detail in each of these areas so you can hopefully get a better understanding of the mapping. So we started with the sources of data and the data sourcing. And here we were really interested in mapping the different sources for local government of the different type of organization they got data from, or they access data from. So here you can see what we've done on the screen. So we added different bubbles for each of the type of sources, so public sector. And I think in the survey, we detailed that in more fine-grained categories, such as NHS board or Police Scotland or different type of government agency and so on. So we had a fine-grained understanding of the different public sector organizations they were sourcing data from. Then private corporation and local businesses, we kind of wanted here to have a distinction between big tech corporation and maybe before that the corporation that were providing services and local businesses that were obviously on a different scale, but that's still private sector data. Then third sector, and grassroots community and citizen research institutions such as the UBDC, for example, but also other research institutions such as the Data Lab and other organizations that collaborate with local government, and connected infrastructure and system sensors. So that's all the new novel data around the Internet of Things that is captured here. So the second area of data engagement we mapped was around data capabilities, and I think in many ways this one was the trickiest one because you would see in the literature, and again I will share the slides and you have the references at the end, but there are a wide range of understanding of what needs to be captured in terms of data related capabilities. So here, for example, you have a framework that includes IT governance, IT resources, attitude towards data, so kind of data culture, legal compliance, data government, and data expertise. So it's really, really broad. And at the same time, you also want to think about the different uses and data activities that I've mentioned earlier in the presentation. So the processing of data, the capturing of data, the maintenance, the analysis and interpretation of data. So it's really a lot of things to capture within data capabilities. But we really wanted to do this because we wanted to capture the needs and potentially the gaps that were impinging local government to use data. So here we settled for different areas that hopefully captured kind of the capabilities and also the different aspects of the data life cycle. So we started with capabilities around human resources and skills. Then we moved on to infrastructures and software. So infrastructure is more the hardware and software are, for instance, visualization tools that they use, but also processing software. Then we had internal capture and retrieval, and here I really try to capture the internal sharing data capabilities and maybe the internal silos and all that worked. Then processing and integration of data within local government, the analysis of data, storage and maintenance, and the last one, which was of interest to us, but also to the, I think spoke to the broader research question, was like whether there was a strategy in place with regard to data use within local government. So the strategical aspect in terms of capabilities here. So that was the second area. The third is around data sharing, and here we really focus on not internal data sharing, because that was captured with the capabilities in the previous slide, but external data sharing, and trying to understand how we can capture that. So instead of having, again, like the potential organization with whom local government could share data, we decided to use the mechanism by which they do share data. And here we listed so graphical user interfaces such as dashboards, application programming interfaces, but also licenses and agreements, such as data sharing agreements, for example, or the publication of open data sets. And for us, that really provided us with a way of capturing the maturity of local government with regard to data sharing. And we saw it as in terms of data access, availability, and visibility. And finally, we were quite interested in exploring whether local government was collaborating with different stakeholders to collect, use, and analyze data. So that's a step further from data sharing. So data sharing is basically implementing protocols to make data accessible to other stakeholders. Here, data collaboration is really working together to create, collect, use, and analyze data and produce insights from data. And here we replicated the number of stakeholders that we know local government is collaborating with in this sector. So overall, we had a good, quite complex map that emerged from this exercise. And this was really useful for us to understand, first of all, the context in which local government data engagement is located, but also to design the survey, which I'm going to come to in a minute, and the survey that we wanted to do to systematically capture what are the data practices of local government. So we designed it around these four broad areas here. And at this stage, oh no, I have another slide on quick tips, and then I will open up for question again. So in terms of tips, practical tips, I would say it's very important to review the academic and policy literature as you would do, but also the gray literature. So for instance, blog posts by data practitioners are quite useful in that way. And it's also quite useful to really capture the terminology that practitioners use, especially if you want to do a survey with practitioners. So keeping in mind your research objectives, questions. So as I said, the terminology we ended up using was added novel types of data because we were really interested in these new forms of data and whether local government were making use of it. And also we had quite a big part on data collaborations and different networks that are emerging in Scotland around data collaboration, because we were also very interested in that. But maybe, you know, if you're not, your research objective aren't really around this, you can have a broader, more finely defined data capabilities, for example. Using mapping and visualization tools, actually it is quite useful to write it down, but also like map it with those tools, and really shows the different areas you can engage with. As I just had the question earlier on, if possible, is great to consult with stakeholders and practitioners. So as I said, we had several meetings with the digital office, and we really discuss with them the relevance and whether the terminology was working, but also whether we have missed any big area of data engagement, and whether they recognize the terminology we used. And create several iterations, use different possible focuses and levels of details, because I think it's really important that you see that data can be looked at in different ways. So you need to make sure that you get the lens that will answer the question you are interested in. So really playing around with it, and it's a process, so you won't get it right the first time around. You really need to play with it for a little bit. Any question at this stage? Okay, I can't see any hands. Was it difficult to match data? Yes, it was. So what was interesting in this project is that we designed a survey, and it was obviously in the context of COVID-19. So for example, we had to map the internal public sector data that local government potentially use in the context of COVID-19. And what we did is we really scoped the literature, and as I said, we also engaged with the digital office for Scottish local government that really helped us to have like a list of different data that local government use. But I also put in the survey a little box saying other, and then please specify, because it was good to capture as much as I could within the survey and list it. But then I was like, oh, is there another type of data I haven't thought of, or the literature hasn't identified? Maybe it's good to give participants also the option to add another type of data. So that was how we went around this. Okay, I'm just going to move on. I'm aware of the time. So let's move on into the design itself. And again, the report, I've provided a link at the beginning. So we designed a mixed methods approach here. And the first part of the project was around scoping the literature, as I said, the mapping exercise that I just showed you, and consultation with stakeholders. And then we used this to design the survey and focus group and interviews. And I'm going to get into more detail about quantitative data collection and qualitative data collection and data analysis. But really using a mixed method approach is referring to a methodology that advanced the integration of quantitative and qualitative data, and that really helps the robustness of the research, but also helps to validate the findings. So you really see, you look at your research questions. So how does local government use data in the context of COVID-19 from different perspectives? So from the survey perspective, or from more qualitative data insight perspective. And that really helps to ensure robustness, but also the validity of your finding. You can corroborate your finding. So here, first we started with a survey of the 32 Scottish local authorities. So as I said, the survey was designed on the mapping scoping exercise that I just went through with you, and in consultation with the digital office. Okay, and we decided to actually have a sample of 64 participants, so two people from each of the 32 local authorities in Scotland. So first, we targeted one data specialist, or someone that had a portfolio around data or digital transformation. And then the second person was around someone working with a team around recovery, or more like senior management kind of level. And we thought that was really useful to have like the more data practitioner perspective and the more like senior management recovery perspective. And that was our way of capturing this perspective. The digital office acted as a gatekeeper and really helped to produce the results. Then the second part of the design was around the qualitative data collection. And here we had two strands, so focus groups, a series of focus groups. And again, we decided a slightly different scope for each focus group. So first of all, the first one was around it was with local authorities among themselves, and they really discuss the type of data they use to respond to the crisis. The second one was around data collaboration and sharing between local authorities and public sector organizations. And the third one was around data collaboration and sharing between local authorities and the third sector organization. So that was really to corroborate some of the survey themes. And we actually used some of the survey results as prompt, and that sort of helped with data triangulation as well. And we had also a series of interviews with experts that were represented in different organizations in Scotland, so Improvement Services, Scottish City Alliance, and so on. So in terms of the data analysis, we did a descriptive statistical analysis of the survey results, and we really combined that with a textual analysis of the experts interviews and focus groups. And we use a range of software to support the analysis and visualization. So we use NVivo, which is quite good for that. And we also use some of the inbuilt software in the GISS online survey as well. And we really did this triangulation to help ensuring the validity and robustness of research. So we looked at whether the emerging themes from the survey were also emerging in the interviews and focus group. And maybe the interviews and focus group would provide us more in-depth insight into something emerging from the surveys. That was really how we did it in terms of triangulation. So just quick tips for mixed methods approach. I'm just aware of the time. So obviously follow ethical guidance. Think about the order of each step and how they feed into one another. So we started with the survey, and it took quite a bit of time to get going and to design. And then we did the focus group and interview kind of roughly around the same time. And because we wanted the survey result to inform the interview, we really had to have a substantial amount of time between the survey and the more qualitative phase of the research. So it's really something to keep in mind when you're designing your research, like the ordering of each step and whether you want to do them simultaneously or one after the other because they inform or they feed into one another. Be aware of the time commitment required to prepare each step. So I think I've touched that with the previous comment. And also make sure that you detail the organizational requirement. So if you need support to run your focus group, if you need if local authorities use specific tools as well. So for example, you will know that local authorities use mostly Microsoft Teams, so you will have to use this. And so really consider all of these organizational requirements, and maybe also consider skill or software training. So for instance, NVivo, or if you want to get into more in more depth with like statistical data, maybe R as well. Okay, and the last, and I will open it to question just in 2 minutes, but the last point is around collaborating with key stakeholders. So the research project we ran in the past year was really successful, and a large part of it was because it was in collaboration with the Digital Office for Scottish Local Government. And the organization really helped with recruitment, especially for survey and focus group, but also they brought their expertise, their perspective on how local government engage with data and really guide us from a practitioner's point of view. So here you can see on the screen the benefit of collaborations. So bringing this variety of perspective and being informed by practitioners' expertise improve the quality of research. And that's really something we've seen in our project and something that you should consider, I think, if you're doing research with local government. It can also facilitate access to outreach organizations and communities. In that specific case, local government aren't necessarily outreach, but I think there are organizations that have limited resources, and it's easier to engage with them if you have a gatekeeper that can introduce you, and if you have someone that shows the relevance of your research also for them. So that really can facilitate this access. And finally, it promotes knowledge exchange, leading to change innovation. I think it's very important to have this impact and kind of applied research built into the design from the beginning, and really making sure that the research question you're examining and you're thinking of are relevant from an academic point of view, but also from a practitioner point of view. And in our research, we draw on the findings and we made policy and practical recommendation for data practitioner in local governments. So quick tips here for collaborating with key stakeholders. So identifying relevant partners, so doing your homework and basically mapping your data ecosystem in local government or in Scotland or wherever the boundary of your research is. Defining the boundaries of your collaboration, so you can have a memorandum of understanding from the start. Also really defining the type of involvement and task that you require from your participants or your collaborators, and the time that it would require. I think it's very important to be clear on that. And that would help you to set and manage expectation, so the specific role, the timeline of the project, when they can expect to have some of the output of the research, what are the anticipated outcome of the research. All of this is quite important to be set at the beginning of the collaboration. And finally, define the communication procedures and collaborative tools. I think I mentioned that. So using Teams, for example, when it comes to local government is a must. But also defining roughly the number of meetings, who is the key contact person, so very practical details here.